Okay, so the Euthyphro problem is a dilemma, and dilemmas are cases where you have two options and both the options are not very good. So let's talk through what the Euthyphro dilemma is. So, the Euthyphro problem goes like this. If I say problem or dilemma, I mean the same thing. We're referring to the same. The Euthyphro problem, the Euthyphro dilemma is the same thing. Okay. So, are actions right or wrong because God commands them, or does God command them because they are right or wrong? All right, so let's walk through this and explain what's going on here. Are actions right or wrong because God commands them? Okay, so what's that mean? What that means is that God commands that certain things are right and certain things are wrong, and God's commanding makes those things right or makes those things wrong. Okay, so killing innocent people for no good reason is morally wrong. All right. Why is it morally wrong according to his first interpretation of divine command theory? It's morally wrong because God commanded it to be the case that killing innocent people is wrong. All right, that's what that first thing is saying. God's commanding makes it wrong. The second option is not saying that. The second option is saying, or does God command them because they are right or wrong? Okay, so this is a little bit different. What this is saying is that things are right or wrong, and then God is commanding those right or wrong things. But God's commanding doesn't make them right or wrong. They're right or wrong prior to God's commanding. So killing an innocent person for no good reason, being wrong, on the second interpretation, that was wrong prior to God saying anything. Okay? And if it was wrong prior to God saying anything, God's commanding in that case, all he's doing is just transmitting knowledge to us. Okay? He's just saying, oh yeah, those things are right, those things are wrong. But unlike the first interpretation of divine command theory in this case, his commanding does not make those things right or wrong. His commanding is just a way to tell us that those things are right or wrong. So you might think of it as a question of priority here. So the idea is that in the first interpretation, this one right here, we have God commanding, and when God commands that, for instance, killing an innocent person is wrong, that makes it wrong. All right, so God's commanding makes the thing wrong. In the second interpretation, we have something that's right or wrong. Let's just stick again with something that's wrong. But killing an innocent person for no good reason, that's wrong. And that was wrong prior to God saying anything, but God's just telling us that it's wrong. Okay? So God's telling and commanding does not make it wrong, it's wrong prior to that. All right? Now, why are both the options not very good? Okay, well, let's look at the second option. The second option being that, so let's suppose you think the second option is the right interpretation, right? Because what this is saying is that, well, divine command theory is ambiguous, and you have these two interpretations here, and either of them might be right? Because remember, divine command theory just says that actions are right because God commands them, and wrong because God forbids them. That's ambiguous because you can interpret that theory as saying one of these two things here. If it's saying the second thing here, then the problem is that God really isn't needed in this case. What does that mean? Why does that matter? Because God's really just telling us, he's the transmitter of moral knowledge to us. But God doesn't play any important role besides being a transmitter of knowledge to us in this theory. And one problem with that is that you might just think that we don't need God to tell us what's right or wrong because we have other theories that have nothing to do with God that can tell us what's right or wrong. In fact, every other theory we'll be looking at has nothing to do with God. Okay, and we can still confidently talk about what's right or wrong. And people typically think certain things are right or wrong anyway without invoking God. Just as a quick example, so again, let's just go back to killing an innocent person for no good reason, right? So if somebody was killed as a result of someone's racial prejudice, right, we think that's morally wrong. Now, if I ask you, well, why is it morally wrong to kill someone out of racial prejudice, right? So you kill some innocent person because you're racist. Why is that wrong? Well, the reason why you might think that is wrong is you can give lots of reasons for that. One reason you might give is that, well, it's wrong because what you did is you ended their life, and as a result of ending their life, you not only caused them a lot of suffering, but you prevent them from having other happiness in their life in the future. You might say that you violated their rights, not just their legal rights. You might have violated, well, you did violate their legal rights, but we're not talking about legal rights here. We're talking about moral rights. So you might have violated their right to life. That might be why that it was morally wrong to do that. There's all sorts of reasons you can give, okay? But you might think violating people's rights or causing them to suffer, right? But those have nothing to do with God, right? Suffering and violating rights, I didn't talk about God at all there, okay? But those are really plausible reasons to think that killing an innocent person out of racial prejudice is wrong, okay? And you might think, another reason you might think it's also wrong is because, well, you think that, well, killing someone out of racial prejudice, right, that's coming from a bad kind of character, right? Being racist is not the kind of person you want to be, and you might think people with those kinds of character acting in that characteristic kind of way are going to necessarily be acting wrongly, okay? That's kind of a convoluted way of me previewing virtue ethics, so if you don't quite get that right now, once we get to virtue ethics, that might make a bit more sense, okay? But in any event, so there's lots of ways you can talk about why that'd be right, or why that'd be wrong to do that, okay? But again, nothing to do with God. So anyway, so the idea is that, one, you don't even need God theoretically in this interpretation. But not only that, but remember, we're trying to give an account of right action. And accounts of right action, remember, are just accounts that are trying to tell us what makes certain actions right, certain actions wrong. Okay, but notice the key component there. It's telling us what makes certain actions right or wrong, right? It's the what that's really important, okay? So if this second interpretation is what's going on, right? God's just telling us the right or wrong things. God's telling us, though, like very explicitly, as I said, doesn't make it right or wrong, he's just telling us. So now it's not even an account of right action anymore. It's just God letting us know. But we don't know what makes the things right or wrong. We don't know why they're right or wrong. God's just telling us. They're like, oh, these are right or wrong. And you ask God, well, why is it the case? Well, maybe he'd tell you, but we don't know just based on this interpretation as it stands right now. Okay, because God didn't make morality in this case. Morality existed prior to God. Okay, now, so that's the problem with the second option. A lot of people don't like the second option because of the reasons I just gave, because God just isn't needed at this point. A lot of people try to pick this first option, that actions are right or wrong because God commands them, so God's command makes them right or wrong. But the problem is that God's commands are arbitrary. Okay, now what's it mean for something to be arbitrary? What it means for something to be arbitrary is that it's done for no good reason. Okay, so for instance, so let's I'm just stick with the killing an innocent person example. So suppose someone kills an innocent person and they get interrogated and they get asked, well, why did you kill that person? And they're like, oh, I don't know, I just kind of like felt like it. I have really no particular reason for doing that, right? I just wanted to do it and I just did it, okay? Wanting to do something or just doing it in that case, when it comes to the taking of human life, you might think that's not a good reason to do that, okay? That's probably a pretty bad reason, all right? So that person's killing of an innocent person was arbitrary. It wasn't done for any good reason. There was no real reason behind it, all right? It was just done, okay? Now, why is God's commandments arbitrary in this first case? The reason why is because, well, in that interpretation of divine command theory, actions are right or wrong because of God's commanding of them. So God commands in this case, for instance, that let's look at maybe a morally right example now. So suppose God commands that giving to charity is a good thing, okay? And suppose you ask God, well, why is it good to give to charity? Under this interpretation, this first option of the dilemma, the reason why it would be good is because God commanded it. So God would say, well, the reason why it's good to give to charity is because I said so. Okay, that's the reason why. I said so is not really a good reason though, right? One problem with that reason is that just means that God can just switch willy-nilly whether certain things are right or wrong, just sort of on the drop of a hat. So God could say one day giving to charity is good, and then he can change his mind the next day and say giving to charity is bad, and then the next day he can say actually murdering innocent people is a good thing. It's not bad at all, actually. And why can he do that? Because it's just whatever God says, right? Whatever God says is right. Whatever God says is wrong. He can change his mind. And there's no further reason past God saying it's right or wrong that makes it right or wrong. That's the key point, okay? So that's why it's arbitrary. Because typically you think, why is it good to give to charity? Well, you might think one reason it's good to give to charity is because you're helping alleviate suffering in the world. That's a reason for giving to charity, though. Saying because I said so, now maybe God wouldn't literally say because I said so, but God saying so isn't that kind of reason. In fact, it's just not a reason at all. Okay. So, in that case, then God's commands are arbitrary. There's no reason behind them. God's just saying that they are, and then they are. Now, you might think, okay, wait a second. I get this whole arbitrary thing. I get how the second option isn't really necessary, but you might think, but wouldn't it be the case that because God's an all-good being, that God couldn't possibly command that murdering innocent people, for instance, is a good thing? You might think that, but here's the problem with that. The problem with that is, if divine command theory is right, okay, so we're talking about right actions right now. We're saying that actions are right because God commands them, or wrong because he forbids them. But really closely related to that is this idea of goodness and badness, right? So we can talk about morally right actions, and we can talk about good actions, which really just mean the same thing, okay? So when we say somebody is morally good, what we're saying is they're the kind of person who does morally right things. So if you're saying, well, look, God is a good being, he's a morally perfect being, so God's a good sort of being that does morally right things, okay? So if you say, well, wait a second, well, God's good though, so God would never command that thing to kill innocent people for no good reason to be a right thing. The problem with that is, well, that might seem tempting. Here's the issue. So if I think divine command theory is right, then what it means for something to be good is God says it's good. That's all it means for something to be good. So when I say that, well, wait, isn't God good? If I say God's good, and all I mean by good, according to divine command, is that God says it's good, well, God being good just means God says God is good. So God really is just endorsing God. That's what it means for God to be good, okay? And you might think, wait a second, that's not what I mean though. I mean something else. I mean that something like, probably something close to the second interpretation of the Euthyphro dilemma. You probably don't mean when you say God is good that God likes God, or God endorses God, or God commands that he himself is good, right? You're probably thinking there's some sort of standard independent of God saying so that makes him good, because he has all these virtuous characteristics. He has all these good characteristics maybe. Or maybe he did these great things, right? If you're a Christian, you might think it's because he sacrificed his only son or whatever, okay? But those are all ideas independent of God saying that he's good that you might think makes him good. But if you're a divine command theorist, you can't do that under that first interpretation. Because all it means for something to be good is just for God to say it's good. So when you say God is good, if you like divine command theory, you're just saying that God says that God is good. And that's really typically not what people mean. Okay. So the Euthyphro dilemma is a pretty big problem for divine command theory. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're religious now, you have this really big problem where, well, if divine command theory is false or seems problematic, then what are you supposed to believe in? A lot of religious people, in fact, don't need to even buy into divine command theory. And in fact, every other theory we'll be looking at, so utilitarianism, the guy who made that, John Stuart Mill, he was a religious man. Kant was religious. Aristotle was religious in a way, but not religious how people are today, at least. But nonetheless, we're looking at three other philosophers who were all religious in a kind of way, but gave us moral theories that had absolutely nothing to do with God at all. Okay, so it's worth noting that if you're religious, you don't have to like divine command theory. And if you think there's lots of problems with divine command theory, that's okay. You can still believe in God, and you can still have a moral theory, but it just doesn't have to be divine command theory. It could be something else. Okay? And speaking of something else, we'll be looking at the several other something else's in this chapter.